All right, today I'm interviewing Christopher Davis-Shannon, also known as the Tin Man, a phenomenal ukulele player and also into the retro ukulele playing and like vintage jazz. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Um, First thing I'd like to ask you about is your instruments. So I've seen you playing, and there's one in particular. It looks like it might be even 100 years old. It's got like a little
Yeah.
crescent moon on it.
Yeah, and actually, it's a common misconception. People that see me playing instruments that I played vintage instruments, and I mostly do not. This uke is actually is about 8 months old.
Really?
Uh, yeah, this is a custom instrument from Liam Kirby at Wondercomer Instruments. It's based off of the late 1800s Nunez designs, which were the original ukuleles from Hawaii that were coming out, the Nunez and the Diaz ukes. So we wanted to do something that was kind of a nod back to that, because I love the tiny sopranos. The body on this thing is, you can see I'm not a tiny guy, and this is a tiny little uke. But the crescent moon inlay was my own design, which is just a nod back to the banjos of the teens and 20s, that this was a very common motif on.
Ah, but it's got a great sound.
It's incredible. And hearing it online is one thing. It is the most ridiculously loud uke I have ever played in my life. I play this busking with the trios and quartets, and this uke can overpower an entire band. It's amazing.
Is that to do with the wood or the structure? What do you think?
A lot of it is the structure. So there's barely any bracing on the top of this, much like the original Martin ones from the 20s. They're very, very thin tops with hardly any bracing, so they resonate very freely. So that's a large part of it, is that the design itself and the lack of bracing. The wood, not so much. It's just a pretty standard mahogany uke. Actually, nothing really too fancy as far as woods on here, but I prefer mahogany over things like koa or spruce, because it's a little bit darker of a tone, where I feel like, especially with fluorocarbon strings on like koa instruments, they can get kind of brittle at least for the sound I'm going for. So it got me in kind of the ballpark what I was looking for.
So what strings do you generally use? So
Yeah, I use Worth Browns. They're the medium gauge, except the C string, which is their heavy gauge on it. I always find that C strings are a little bit too floppy on this short of a scale instrument, so I generally have to go up a gauge so that I have close to even tension across the strings.
what else? What else you got in your ukulele collection there?
Yeah, actually, I don't own many ukes. I roll with all of my instruments, which is, if they don't go to gigs with me, they don't deserve to be in my house.
Yeah.
It's pretty much it. So actually, let me grab one over here. So I have two wooden ukes that I use. So I keep one in C6 tuning and one in traditional D6 tuning,
Yep. Yeah.
which acts really well as a capo as well for when I'm playing live. So that's an Ohana. This is another modern instrument. It's an SK39.
Okay.
Pretty big. It looks like the fancy Martins, and it sounds pretty darn good. I don't think you can beat it for under $500. I think something like that.
Yeah.
But this is what I use a lot. This is the one I keep up in D tuning. So I don't play it on my online lessons as much, because we teach everything in C.
Yep.
But when you see me at a gig, I swap between ukes, and then I also have this banjolele, which is just to have a different tone.
That was my next question.
Yeah, and this is another modern instrument. This is made by David Pratt, who he used to be based in Barcelona. I believe he's in Scotland now. He just moved recently. And so just another handmade little uke. I love this. It's too loud to play online.
Can you give us a quick strum? Cool.
It is a loud instrument.
So that brings us on to like with the banjo ukulele onto like some. So a lot of the stuff you do is early 20th century, like 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, Yeah, pretty much World War II is my cutoff. We hit right about 1943 is about where my repertoire cuts off. Sans a couple Tin Pan Alley tunes that came later than that.
And so, like, Cliff Edwards was well known as a ukulele player from that era. Do you study these guys, or what?
Of course. I mean, to me, that's the best way to learn. I mean, when we talk about uke players from that era, of course, Cliff Edwards, but also known as a great vocalist. And you have people like Art Fowler as well, who played tenor uke earlier than most other people. But again, it was accompaniment for his vocals, and I'm a huge fan of Roy Smeck, who's actually from Lancaster, which is about an hour west of me.
Who was that again?
Roy Smeck, the Wizard of the Strings.
Roy Smack.
Yes, S-M-E-C-K. And if you've ever seen the first talking film ever, The Jazz Singer, there's a short in front of that of a man playing ukulele and tenor banjo. And before that film aired, so when people went to go hear the first talking motion picture ever, they heard Roy Smeck playing the Tiger Rag in front of that. And he was a vaudevillian musician who did just things with uke that you would never, ever dream of. And because of being on the vaudeville circuit as well, he was a great showman as well. He had all these big fancy show strokes that he would do, but just an absolute master of pretty much anything with four strings on it. As I said, tenor banjo as well. He also played Hawaiian lap steel guitar, and he wrote a number of method books for uke as well. Plus, one of the great things of being in the YouTube generation that we're in is you can find a lot of old video recordings of Cliff Edwards, of Roy Smeck, of Art Fowler, of George Formby, of all these great players from back in the day, and you could slow them down to a quarter speed and see exactly what they were doing with their right hand, which is really where the magic comes from. And I think this is how I approach really learning any instrument. I started playing music when I was about 4 years old. I played a little bit of violin and then piano, and then moved on to clarinet when I was about 8 or so. And I think the key to really learning any instrument is to study the masters and transcribe what they did, not necessarily to do what they did, but to understand where they were coming from and see you have to know what's already been done on an instrument before you can try to do something fresh with it.
Okay. And so I mean, George Formby was extremely well known, and like you mentioned, his right hand was like
incredible. Yeah. And the fun thing about he's known so much for the split stroke. And I actually have a new book coming out on George Formby next month. I'm just waiting for the illustrations back from my illustrator, called the George Formby Handbook, there's a lot of great transcription books of his techniques and going over everything he did. But I wanted to break it down from more of how can we put this in modern playing context? We have to understand how he did what he did, how it related to the music. So it's a bit more analytical of a book than other people put out with just, really breaking down exactly what he did, but not necessarily explaining behind it. Because we think of the split stroke is really based mostly off 2/3 and 3/2 clave rhythms. You have this straight eighth note against underlying triplet feel that the jazz orchestra would be playing at the time, which is what gives it that unique sort of sound. And we hear that in American jazz all the time, the feel of 2 against 3 when we have double time in there. And Formby was really doing exactly that. But his techniques, the split stroke and things like that, you actually see the split stroke first described in Ernest Caillet's 1917 method book, which was one of the very first ever written for ukulele, long before Formby was on the scene. And you also see it in Smeck's method book that was written in the 20s, because it's this special technique that really only works on uke because we have reentrant tuning. And Formby's the one that really took that. I think they all came up with it independently, mind you, playing between the two outer strings. It was just kind of a natural thing to do on a reentrant tuned instrument. But Formby took that and really took it to a level that no one else ever dreamed of. And I don't believe he read music or really had much formal training. And especially his understanding of rhythm and syncopation was light years ahead of what other people were doing on the instrument at the time. And I think it's something that's really beneficial for players still to learn today, because there really is so much going on in his solos, and understanding the different aspects and how he put them together, I think is a really important part of a ukulele journey. I didn't know who he was till a couple of years ago, because in America, no one knows who George Formby is.
Really?
Yeah, it's great outside of the diehard uke fans. He was just never really that popular here, to be honest. He had a huge following up until the 70s or so in England, I believe, and in any of the former British colonies. I think sans America, because we're the oddball. But
I think actually a lot of that actually gets back to the American. From what I've read, and I'm not American, I'm Australian, but from what I've read, the American music scene was like the union was very strong in keeping out people, overseas musicians, and I think that's probably general with. I know in Australia it was a similar, from what I've read. Like if you go back, 80 years, if you were a foreign musician, you weren't welcome, and countries did their best to keep people from overseas out.
Yeah, there's that aspect, and there's also just how the recording industry worked back then. It was a lot of regional labels, and the radio markets were regional as well. So even like me living in Philadelphia would not be hearing the same cuts that people were hearing in Chicago at the same time during that time period, let alone music from overseas. So I think there's a great story of Django Reinhardt coming over to play a gig with Duke Ellington. I think it was a Duke. It was either a Duke or Count. I can't remember. And Django Reinhardt was this huge star in France and most of Western Europe. Everyone knew who he was. And of course, being Django, he arrives like 2 hours late for the gig and gets on stage and gets announced, and no one has any idea who he is. Never heard of the guy. And it was just the most demoralizing thing for him. He finally got this opportunity to gig in America. I was like, yeah, okay. Who the hell are you?
What can you do? What can you show us? Yeah.
Right. And of course, one of the finest guitar players ever, but also a very different idiom than what was happening in American jazz. His style of playing actually came out of Philadelphia partially. He got a hold of some recordings by Eddie Lang and Joe Venuti, and that's what really inspired him to create the Hot Club of France and infused that with the Balkan music and all of that. That really made it what it was. But if you listen to those early Lang and Venuti cuts, it's so similar to the early Django recordings, because that's what they were trying to emulate.
Yeah, wow. So someone that you've done a lot of songs that, like, I'm trying to use the arrangements. You've done. I'm trying to use the word, avoid cover versions. Arrangements of songs made famous by Gene Austin. So Gene Austin seems to be someone close to your heart.
Yeah, oh, certainly. And I mean, one of the great things, Gene recorded most of his records at RCA Victor, which is about 5 miles from where I live. And I grew up in southern New Jersey, right down the street from the record plant. So, I mean, there's that aspect of it. So, again, because the regional record scenes, Gene Austin records when I was younger, really easy to find. But Gene was, the ultimate of the crooner generation, probably the most popular of anyone. He was a superstar beyond what people really imagine today, and the sway he had in the music scene was huge. But so he was really known for premiering songs. He had the first hits of so many tunes, because record producers, you want to give it, especially back then, you wanted to give it to a name artist who you knew if Gene Austin sang it, it was going to be a hit. That was just what it was. Same thing with Al Jolson back in the day. But the thing I love about Gene especially is his diction is amazing, because he comes from a classical music background, which means, from my arrangements, I do a lot of the original verses and intros to these old jazz standards, which are generally lost along the way. And on Gene's recordings, you can make them out really well if you have to transcribe the lyrics yourself in the absence of original sheet music. Gene, to me, was a godsend finding his repertoire to be able to learn the songs off of, because the recordings are so clean. And that's actually my main reason for loving Gene, is the recordings are so good for the day, and his diction is so good that you can hear exactly what's happening. Another guy in that vein that I think should be mentioned is Nick Lucas.
Say that again.
Nick Lucas, who's often looked over. He had one of the first hits with "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." Was Nick Lucas, known as a crooner. I mean, what an absolutely amazing tenor voice! But his guitar playing was I mean, virtuosic, to say the least. You have these guitar breaks in there that are just absolutely mind-blowing style of, you know, old school plectrum chord melody guitar, which we don't hear a whole lot of anymore. And again, just transcribing them. It all goes back to like finding the seminal versions of the tunes and learning from that, and see how the tune built off of that over the years, because songs evolve as they live, and that's one of the joys of music. You know, my Blue Heaven, Gene Austin's probably biggest hit, that almost never happened because of a contract dispute between the publishers and RCA Victor. You can't be signed to a different label and do it. You have your own in-house songwriting teams at the time. Everything was very encapsulated. And Gene finally got to see, he was trying to record the tune, I think it came out in 27, it was written in 24, for 3 years, because he was friends with the songwriter. And RCA Victor wouldn't let him record it because union disputes, things like that. And he finally, if you listen to that recording, the instrumentation on the first hit of it is Gene singing, piano, cello, and bird calls.
And what's the last instrument?
Bird calls, whistling.
Oh, bird calls, sorry. Bird calls.
And if you listen to the repertoire of the day, you generally have a full orchestra in there with you. And the A side of the record, this was the B side of the record, the A side of the record is a full orchestra. And what happened is the union guys started packing up at the end of the session because they hadn't been hired to play that tune because it still wasn't settled. So he ended up grabbing the guys who would still play, which was a pianist that was not the pianist on the section. He was a song plugger, which are the guys that would go to the artists and pitch the new songs and play piano and sing them. They're like the most amazing sight readers ever. A stagehand that could whistle, and a cellist. That's why the instrumentation is so darn weird on that recording, is because it almost never happened. And Gene finally just got them to hit record, and it was a massive hit for RCA Victor Records, where it was in 1924. It was not, when it came out, not a huge hit, which says something, you know, for having the right person record it matters so much.
It was, a lot of songs from that era would be released multiple times, but it's quite a different scene.
Yeah, you know, you have guys rushing to have the hit of the first recording of a tune.
So leading back to, so you're talking about transcribing these songs. Maybe you can describe the process you go through, like when because some of them you're transcribing, but I think probably some of them you're doing your own arrangements of too.
Yeah. So for my solo arrangements, like solo uke arrangements, they're my own. When I do lead sheets, like just basic chord charts for tunes, I try my best to do it to the most popular early recording, because the changes are different depending who you listen to. You know, you think of Gene Austin's version of Bye Bye Blackbird. Yep. And then you take Miles Davis's version of Bye Bye Blackbird, which is what most people know now. Yep. Way different changes. Yeah. Because it was a pop tune. It was, you know, these weren't written as solo vehicles for jazz musicians. They were appropriated as solo vehicles for jazz musicians. Just
for anyone who's like not a musician watching, so changes means your chord progression. So just clarifying.
Chord progression.
Yeah, we'll call it changes, but I use the same terminology, but just for anyone who's not familiar with that term. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing is when we're playing ukulele, we're handicapped, but we're also blessed because of the chord voicings that we can use on there, but also ones that we can't. We end up playing a lot of, you know, rootless voicings because we only have 4 notes to work with, and 2 of those notes are probably going to be less than a third away from each other because of the high G tuning. So ultimately, you can really only do triads on there. Yeah. So you end up in ukulele arranging with approximating the harmony as best you can, because you can't always get the full picture. You certainly can't get bass movement all the time. And when it comes to transcription, when I'm sitting there listening to the recordings and trying to figure out what's happening, you know, bass movement is always the first thing I listen for. And I'm biased because I'm a bass player. But I think that's the easiest thing, especially in the old recordings. The bass players are playing the root of the chord, or the fifth of the chord. So it's really easy to pick that out. And then you listen for the quality of the chord, whether it's a minor 7th, major 7th, you know, diminished, those things. Hear the triad first, and then hear the extensions. And then I transcribe the melodies independently. And then you have to kind of go back and check and see, like, okay, I hear a major chord, a major triad here with this note underneath. This is what's happening on the melody over top. So I have a couple options as to what the actual chord could be when I get here, and it comes down to all of the harmonic movement between the chords. So it's a bit of a labor to do, but I want it to be close to correct, at least. And as I said, it depends what recording you get it from. Even from the same artist, you just have some Fats Waller arrangements of different tunes throughout the years, and things are different. So it's, what's the popular recording? What boils it down to being closest to what maybe the composer or the original artist intended.
The real book spoiled everything.
The real books. All right, so I get to do my tirade here. I studied jazz in college on upright bass, and for a lot of us, real book was gospel, but the real book's based off of specific versions of tunes.
Yes.
We take Honeysuckle Rose as it's written in the real book. Is the Fats Waller changes or close to it? You have a 2-5-2-5-2-5-1 in the A section, but then you go in the world of Django Reinhardt, in the Manouche jazz world. If you listen to the mid 30s, late 30s hot club recordings of Django, you listen to the rhythm guitar. It's 5-chord the entire time. There's no interplay between the two, which the harmony is very similar, but it depends what recording you're listening to. So a lot of people, depending what circle they grew up in, what they listen to, but a lot of people, especially youngsters these days, are only reading off the real book, which I think is actually a huge problem in jazz, because you're ignoring how we got to that arrangement of the tune. What we now, like Bye Bye Blackbird in the real book, which I think is in volume 2, are the Miles Davis changes. But they're not anything written before like 57, any version of that year before 57, which that song's from 24, I think, so you have 25 years of the tune being played completely differently and recorded by hundreds upon hundreds of artists differently. This happens to be the seminal version that we look at in the real book, but is that right? Everyone has to know that that's the arrangement we're working off of. So I have the real book is a great tool, but I think people need to make sure that they don't make chord charts a crutch. There's nothing that can replace using your ears when you're
exactly. Finally, so I'm interviewing you, but you've got your own set of interviews that you're doing with other ukulele players. So it's called Checking In. It's on your website. So when I write my blog post, I'm going to put as many links to as much stuff that you do up there. So tell us about Checking In.
Yeah, so Checking In is it's not just uke players. I'm doing singer-songwriters on different instruments. I had a great interview with Jonathan Stout, who's probably one of the best chord melody players out there. I should just finish one up with a great upright bass player. So pretty much any musician or artist that I'm interested in, I want to talk to. And this is a great excuse to do it. This is a series I've wanted to do for years, but because I'm on the road so much and I gig so much and I create so much content outside of that, I didn't have a lot of free time. And then, a pandemic hit. And I sat in my apartment for pretty much 3 months doing nothing. So I had to find ways to occupy myself. So I said, let's start this. So I started writing emails to people. And really the thing is, I want to have people come on and play, and I want to showcase what they do. But it becomes more of a casual conversation between musicians. We get to nerd out about things like music theory and arranging and silly gigs that we've had over the years, as opposed to, which I'm sure you've had a million of. There's always the stories from the gigs and the bandstand, and and I love talking about those things with other musicians, and that's what we do after gigs when we're playing festivals and the like. The musicians are hanging and jamming after the gig, and we're swapping these stories, and I think they're really nice things to kind of have out in the public as well, to see everyone sort of the backside of what's happening in the music industry. And I think a lot of people think that we just get on stage, play music, and that's the end of the day, when that's like the culmination of years of work. That's the easy part.
So let's hear a Christopher Davis-Shannon silly gig story.
Oh, a silly gig story. Oh man, God, I have so many. There's the time Pete Seeger told me to turn down my bass. That was one of my personal favorites.
Oh, wow.
We're playing Pete would host these festivals in the Hudson River Valley to support children's education and things like that on his property. Where he went, I went up. I was lucky enough to be. He owned a farm up there. He chopped his own wood till the day he died. The man was just incredible. But I had a band. That tour, there's a rockabilly band in my early 20s. They were friends with that group of musicians and brought us up. And at the end, we would all get together, and there'd be a little hill that all the artists would play on, and Pete would come and he'd play the tunes with everyone. And and I'm the only bass player. I'm the only upright bass player. And I'm like 10 feet behind Pete, and we're doing the final "This Land Is Your Land" on there. And he looks back at me and goes, "Hey, can you turn that thing down?" Of course, it's an acoustic instrument. No, I cannot turn it down. I'm not plugged into anything. I think that was the favorite time I've gotten yelled at on stage.
Yeah.
You're damn loud. But yeah, I mean, just we get around so much, and so many of them are silly situations that we get ourselves in on the road.
Certainly are. All right. So you've got a few books and stuff that you sell to do with playing ukulele.
I do, yeah. So I'm finishing up a Formby style book right now.
So you mentioned that earlier. So you said that'll be ready in about a month.
Yeah, hopefully actually just a couple of weeks. As I said, the content's done, the videos are recorded. I'm waiting for the final illustrations from my illustrator. I cannot draw, so.
And what format will that be? An ebook, or will that be?
There'll be ebook. There will also be a physical copy of that. Will be around probably about a month after the ebook comes out. Yeah. And anyone, I have a Patreon that I post up lessons on and other content, but all of my patrons get a copy of the ebook of any of my ebooks, because I have another one out of arrangements called Smile, which is 5 arrangements for solo ukulele of all those old tunes. And then I also have a book of Christmas arrangements, which is entirely in campanella, so finger style. It's an old Baroque guitar technique that's been adapted to ukulele. So I have a whole book of Christmas arrangements in that as well, called 12 Days of Christmas.
And how are your fingernails going?
Terribly. I'm just not a fingernail guy. People always ask me if I grow my fingernails out and manicure them. Part of it's because I play upright bass. I play slap upright bass a lot of the time. I can't have nails to do that, and they wear down in 2 days when I'm playing uke. So I just don't even bother. That's life for me.
Yeah. All right, grit it out.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Yeah. All right. Well, Christopher Davis-Shannon, thank you so much for speaking with me today, and very insightful, and it's an amazing wealth of knowledge that you have.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about these things.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay.
Sure.
Okay.